Tonight we are thrilled to have a very lively program. Every chance I get. Presented by Jennifer Stucker and Huron.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I'm hoping this does not explode. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Welcome. I am Jennifer Stucker. I am one of the board members of the Historical Society. I'm also the chairperson of the Cemetery Committee at the Historical Society. And I have a question first for all of you. How many of you have heard the first chunk of this story about the Mill Pond Cemetery restoration that was, the last time I told this story was maybe 2010, something like that? I know some of you were there because I remember you being there, but just, who's heard any of this before? Okay, great. All right, so most of you have not, which is great. The Mill Pond Cemetery, that's what it looks like today. Before we get started on this, it was basically a 10-year project to resurrect a cemetery, the original village cemetery in what is now the village of Corea, which started out as the village of Indian Harbor, hence the title of this program. And it was abandoned over 100 years ago. But before I get started, and that's why it needed to be resurrected, because it was lost completely in the weeds. Before I get started, I wanted to thank a couple of organizations which, without their support, cheerleading, all that good stuff, none of this would have happened. And I certainly wouldn't have had the momentum to go forward. And the Historical Society is one of them, because they play a very important role, and we'll get to that. But especially the members and friends and just hangers-on of Seaside Grange in Korea, because this started out as a Grange project. And it ended up enveloping many of the people in the village, whether they were Grange members or not, it didn't matter. We took all helpers, summer people, their children, their grandchildren, whoever came by got involved. Also the Maine Old Cemetery Association and the Fund for Schoodic, which also supported us in a very substantial way later on. So, like I said, we started with this in 2006 because Sally Crowley, who is now passed away, but many of you may remember as resident of Korea, Hancock County Treasurer, town manager here in Gouldsboro, a little bit of everything. Sally was a Grange member, and she came to a meeting one night and said, has anybody seen the Mill Pond Cemetery lately? It is atrocious. It is falling into rack and ruin, it's being vandalized, the stones are falling over, it's being lost. This is the town's heritage, we should do something about this. And maybe the Grange should take this on as a community service project. And I raised my hand and I said, oh, I like old cemeteries, I'll be in charge. Big mistake, but I did it anyway. And that started a 10-year project to reclaim the Mill Pond Cemetery, which, as I said, had been abandoned about 100 years before. So this was in 2006, and with my magic wand, here it is. The other person who was instrumental in this, because Sally brought this up to the Grange, Nick Woodard, who's another Korea resident. He's the grandson of Edith Woodard, who was like 175 years old when she finally passed away, but we've lost her too. But Edith was a lifelong resident in the village, and she was a big fan of old cemeteries, veterans' graves, you name it. She spent many, many, many hours at her kitchen table talking to me about this and what her recollections were, what her daughter's recollections were, who's sitting up here in the front row, who had done one of the earlier transcriptions for us. And Edith whipped this sheaf of papers out at one point and said, well, she was actually claiming credit for it. Finally, after about 5 of these conversations, she said, well, actually, I never went down there, Judy did. So we have one of Judy's transcriptions to thank for this. So anyway, we had a lot of help along the way. But tonight I want to tell you about the whole story. Like I said, it took us 10 years. So that means in 2016, we were done. We are now in maintenance mode. And I'll explain how that works too. But I want to tell you a little bit of who, what, where, when, why, And how the heck did that happen tonight? So let's see if this works. And it does. Okay, so where? I recognize most of the faces here. Most of you know where Korea is. It's here on the Skutik Peninsula. It's at the tail end of the Skutik Peninsula. So that right there is this Oceanside Meadows Inn, or what used to be, or whatever. That's the sands right there. So Prospect Harbor's over here, and you know the rest. This is the harbor itself. No, that's not it, never mind. So this is the village of Korea down here. This is a map from 1881. At that point, it was called Indian Harbor. The name was changed in 1896 to Korea. Lots of explanations of why that is. Short answer is Korea got its own post office in 1896. And one of the many legends is that the daughter of the postmaster at the time had heard the name Korea. It was in the news. It really is about Korea, the country, because Japan had occupied Korea, and it was very much in the newspaper. People read it, international news a lot then. And in those days, Korea, the country, was spelled with a C. So that's how we got the C. Korea, the country, got the K much, much later, but we still have the original spelling. Anyway, before that, it was Indian Harbor. And rumor has it, the post office said, there's too many Indian this, Indian that's, all over the state, pick something else. So they picked Korea, and that's what we get to keep. So this is a cadastral map. A cadastral map basically has the names of the property owners on the geography. So if you look at it, I mean, if you could, because we have to keep, the slides keep getting larger and smaller. Here are the originals. In 1881, the village was moving quite along. It was settled originally, roughly 1810, 1812. The stories are a little fuzzy. But by 1881, there were quite a few settlers in the village of Korea. It was mostly subsistence, fishing, and farming. There wasn't much of a cash economy, and we'll find out why that's important later. But the village originally started right here. That is Crowley Island, and the original settlers landed there, set up camp there, and started multiplying there. And then as families married families, and you started having more expanded groups, they expanded around the harbor. And then this is what we know as Cranberry Point. It's always been Cranberry Point. And there were a number of settlements along there. But right back here, this bit of water, if you know Korea at all, there is a bay. This is Gouldsboro Bay back here. And the bay, off the bay, is Mill Pond. And it's also known as Ward's Cove. That's how it's labeled here, is Ward's Cove. We call it the Mill Pond now, but it's a tidal bay. And this map is not exactly correct, but roughly, right there, if this were correct, there's a reversing falls. And there was a mill there, and it was a lumber mill, because back when the original land grants were given to John Gould, Jones, and Shaw by the governor of Massachusetts, thing one, economic development 101 here, was clear the lumber. Basically, it was all about extraction economies. And their job was to lay out logging roads, bring in logging crews, cut down everything that wasn't moving, mill it, and ship it out. That was step one. Next, you bring in settlers, who will be farmers, fishermen, whatever. People who will settle the land, eventually may be able to buy the tracts that they're living on, and become residents somewhere along the line, 1820. Maine becomes a state, and now they're Mainers instead of Massachusettsers. But back when that was a mill, this area of the village was, I wouldn't say it was downtown, but it was a hotbed of activity, because all the trees that were cut from this area up here and then brought down through streams, down Gouldsboro Bay, any way they could, they had to get them to these lumber mills. So that's what was going on in probably the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, when the original settlers were moving in. So Mill Pond Cemetery is, well, I'll show you another map because it's a little more fun to look at. Mill Pond Cemetery is right about there. where my little green dot is trying to hold still. And there's a good reason for that. Okay, this is a modern, 2009, it's not modern anymore, but it's newish aerial view of the landscape now. So this is the Korea Peninsula here. We've got Cranberry Point, Korea Harbor. There's our crop circle, used to be the Navy. And if you can see this blue line, it's a little faint, so I'll try to follow it with my magic dot. This blue line is the town road that goes, there's a seawall right here, goes around to Crowley Island. And right here is Mill Pond Road, which goes up this ledge. And right there is the cemetery. Okay? Now, a little backstory. If you're familiar, if you live in Korea, you know this painfully well. Like, you couldn't dig a hole there if you wanted to. It's this bit right here is bog surrounded by rocks. So you still wouldn't want to dig a hole there. This is Crowley Island. Okay? It's a little raised. The basics of the landscape in Korea is it's ledge. Ledge, peat bogs. Occasionally you will hit soil pockets. Any place you see a lawn in Korea, chances are somebody, like in my house, somebody brought in a bunch of sand to let grass grow. Because otherwise, you just have bare rock. Not hospitable. So, if you have a bunch of people settling, and what happens is when people settle, they also die, where the heck are you going to put them? Because you can't dig a hole in a rock. Now, this is a much more modern map. This is 1927. If it were less fuzzy, you could see, again, here's the town road called Crowley Island Road. Here's the seawall. There's Young's Point. That's Crowley Island right there. See what happens here? This is Mill Pond Road, more or less where it is today, and it forks. It goes this way to the mill pond and this way to the mill. That's the track that the oxen or whoever else was asked to drag, or the people for that matter, who dragged the logs either into the mill or they're traveling back out. That's the route they took, right there. It was a forked road, and the cemetery is right there, right in the middle. And that's really handy because the Mill Pond Road has moved over time, unfortunately. So that makes it even more complicated. You're trying to figure out where the heck on the ground things are supposed to be, but they're not. Well, when you find out the road moved, that explains a lot. But by talking to people like Edith, and Warner Briggs, and Kendall Campbell, who's here somewhere, I saw him, and others who kind of know the origins of this place, they remember bits and pieces. Like, well, the road used to go over that ledge that you see, but then it went down the hill and it followed that track, and it did this forky thing, and the cemetery was right there in the middle, and the entrance to the cemetery isn't where it used to be. Well, that explains a lot, because when Nick Woodard told me about this cemetery 30 years ago and said, oh, you like old cemeteries, you go down there off the mill pond, you march down through the weeds, and you follow the track, and you'll come right to it. Which was true, but when you come out of the woods and are looking, you're looking at the backs of all the stones. That's not the way cemeteries work. That's how you work after the fact, when you've lost your entrance, but I knew we were starting backwards from the beginning. That's what it was. That's what it looked like. When Sally said, oh, this is horrible, this is atrocious, on, that's June 2006, when my husband John, who's standing here behind the camera, and daughter Emily, and the dog, who was about this tall, so he was not happy, went marching down there and went, uh-oh. We had seen it many, many years before when Nick told us about this. And in those days we used to come in the fall, and we had seen it in the fall and wandered around and went, whoops, there's a stone there, hello. And there were a number of stones that were still standing, but it was pretty bad, it was in bad shape. That is like 20 years before this picture was taken. So 2006, June, when Sally's saying we ought to do this, we go down and suss it out and say, okay, right. Probably we need to wait till fall, because you try to do anything in this vegetation, you're going to be, first thing you have to do is mow it somehow. And when you try to take it on like that, you're going to hit stuff, you're going to do damage. You need to wait till the leaves fall, the vegetation goes down as much as possible. We'll wait until, not November, December. No, what's in November? Hunting season. So they can wait till December, we'll be here. Now, these, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the who or the what. I'm not sure what that is. Here's what we saw, however, though, in June when we're tromping around in the weeds. Just some examples of what things look like. This is Samuel Young. He's down in the weeds. That's Rebecca, his granddaughter. You'll hear a lot more about her later. Let's run through these. That is a footstone. Now, somebody reminded me earlier that not everybody knows what a footstone is. A footstone, traditionally in grave maintenance, you would have a stone at the head of the grave. So if I'm the deceased and I'm lying down, there's my headstone, hence the name, that has my name and my vital statistics and maybe a lovely verse. It's right behind my head. The footstone is at the end of my feet. And that's so you know where the grave ends. You have short people, you have long people, you have limited space, particularly in a place like Korea. We'll get to why it's there in a minute. So footstones mark the end, and often, this is a mark, every stone you're going to see is marble. And marble is very soft. And see those little white scratchy bits there? That's what the metal blade of a trimmer will do when you're just going back and forth. You know, you can see you're going back and forth, and back and forth, and you're mowing the stone at the same time. That's why we didn't want to do this in June, because we didn't want to do a whole lot more of that kind of damage. So, remember, we're worried about vandalism, theft, and things going to rack and ruin, when really some of the biggest offenders are, well, what I call cemeteries being loved to death, and one of those things is mower damage. Very common. And marble is incredibly soft. That's the other thing. It's why they used it for tombstones. You could carve it by hand. There's no granite in this cemetery that is carved, because granite carving of tombstones didn't happen until much later, and in this rural, out in the willywags part of Maine, it was later still. So this is another marble stone, also down. When we started, this is Little Forest. He was one of the few vertical stones. He's way down in the corner, though. And so that was another mystery. When we started, there were 14 marble stones above ground. Only 3 of them were vertical. And even some of those were actually not where they belonged. They were just kind of propped up vertical. This is a rock. But it's not just any old rock. It's somebody's headstone. It happens to be just a couple spaces down from where Forrest, the last one, was. The burials in the cemetery are mostly marked with rocks. Okay? Remember I said it was subsistence fishing and farming? Well, that tombstone of Forrest, I believe he's 1881, would have cost about $15 in 1881, cash. That's a lot of money for somebody who doesn't have a cash income. To the extent that people had a cash income at all, they needed to spend it on things that they couldn't grow or barter for or whatever themselves. So a marble tombstone would have been an outrageous luxury. So you had to have parents who somehow had a cash income to have that. That's why the vast majority of the cemetery is marked with rocks. But the cool part is, and we'll get to this, even if the rocks are there, they have a head and a foot. Okay? So, back to 2006. That's June. We come back. I came back in November, checked it out. It looked like that, but no leaves. But, okay, our work is cut out for us. And we came back. This is December 1st in 2006. I don't know if you can tell from this fudgy photograph, but somebody has come and mowed it, mysteriously. Not at my behest. They just showed up and did it. Not only did they mow it, they carted away all the brush, which is a very important part, because as it turns out, if you just leave it lay, which is what had been happening, about once a decade, somebody would come in and say, this is atrocious, stones are being lost, on and on and on. They would mow it, leave all the slash line on the ground, which would then deteriorate, and the soil would build up. And over time, all the stones were disappearing because the ground level was building up. So that's what we saw in 2006. That is the following summer. That's July 10th, 2007. So a little bit about that mowing. It took me 6 months, but I did finally find out what happened. Somebody who's a descendant of the people in this cemetery, and her brother, who happens to love to mow things, had gotten to the point, that decade interval, when they said, it's falling into rock and roll and it's being lost, da da da, and they came over and mowed it. And they just apparently had been doing this for a while. So we come back in July now, and we're ready to start doing stuff. So we do a mowing. Now we're mowing a soft growth. We're not mowing alders and trees and blackberries and stuff. We're mowing just soft, fluffy stuff. So it's much easier. There's a lot of junk to rake up. See the blue flags? Oh, I have a sample blue flag right here. Okay. And I don't know if you remember the dog. He was in the previous picture. He donated these. We have probably about 100 blue invisible fence flags because he was all up to snuff on his invisible fence protocol by that time, and we didn't need them. And it turns out you can buy survey flags at Home Depot or hardware stores or whatever, but then you got to remember about this project. We had zero money, so we couldn't buy anything. We had people bringing us sand, all kinds of supplies. But Rimney donated the invisible fence flags, and what I discovered over time, because we actually did buy some later, just from the hardware store, they hold up forever. We went around ahead of time, and every place we saw stone on the ground, obviously, mark that. So here it is, don't go anywhere near this thing. And then when we're careful and checking with our feet and stuff, so anything that was on the surface that might be hit got marked, pre-marked with a blue flag, and then when John, my magic mower guy, came through, he could avoid hitting those things and beating the heck out of them. And the other thing about the stones is they seem to be scattered all over the place. There was no obvious systematic arrangement. It's not like we walked in there and there were all these rows, they were just flopped over. No. There was a stone here, there was a stone there. Remember Forrest Tracy, who was over there with that rock? He's way over here. There's a big, okay, so the squares are actually headstones. The X's are just other suspicious stones that we came across. They're on the surface, like maybe not, don't know yet. These round blobbies are trees. Most of them were dead. And then there are these fudgy stone piles. They're just random humps in the middle of the field. They'll be like a big bump. It'll be rocks on top. Okay, whatever. And then, but you've got Forrest sitting way out here by himself, little marble stone, and then rocks all around him. So that's my basic interpretation, standing there in this roughly rectangular field and saying, okay, this is, what your brain wants to do is put everybody in rows. You see, I'm like putting these people in rows. Well, they weren't really. It's just that's a very rough sketch. The one thing we know, people always ask, well, weren't there records? Didn't somebody keep records about this cemetery? Nope. The only official record we had to go on that are hived out of a piece of private property, it is still inside a piece of private property. The reason this is a cemetery, it can be a cemetery, given where it is, and it's a weird spot, is because they knew there was soil there. It's actually an old peat bog, but it's deep enough. It was Noah Young's property. Noah lived there until 1892, I believe, when he died. He is the son of one of the original settlers, and it was his potato field. Now you can find out that he raised potatoes because the Historical Society has all these wonderful personal journals of people who traded their labor, and I believe it was a young man named Hill who dug potatoes for Noah Young. Bingo! I knew what Noah Young was doing in that field. So when Noah was getting to his advanced age in his late 80s, he knew he was probably not going to be around forever. So by that time, they'd been using his field as a cemetery for at least 20, maybe more years. We'll never know. No records. So he reserved it when he sold the property out of his family. He reserved the burial ground out of the deed. That's very common. That's often how old family cemeteries, what start as family cemeteries anyway, are protected in Maine. When the property is sold out of the family, they reserve that bit that is the cemetery out. Now, what they don't say is where it is. They don't survey it. They'll say something like, what this one said was, accepting out a burial ground, approximately 3 rods by 5 rods. A rod is 16.5 feet, so that means 50 feet by 80 feet, and reasonable access there too. That's it. That's the public record about this cemetery. So what we've been given the clue now is that it's roughly 50 by 80. And I can tell you that from there to there is about 79 and a half feet. And from there to there is 50. So what's going on here? When we mowed that space, well, when Loretta mowed the stuff in the fall and the winter, and when we mowed the following July, we mowed what had been traditionally mowed. You can tell because it was alders and puckerbrush and, all kinds of stuff, and then really tall alders and puckerbrush and trees and whatever. So we went to the edge that had been mowed before. And it turns out, and it was pretty much, that is roughly the shape, for sure. And like I said, this bit is 80 feet. That's what they've been mowing forever. But it sure as heck was not 50. They went the 50, there were random stones all through there, and then they kept going, because Forrest and his family are down there in the corner. So, another mystery. So, now, we had to set up some kind of process. We knew we had this 50 by 80, but really it's more like 100 by 80 at this point, field with rocks and tombstones strewn about, and it became a research project. John and I are both research people, and we know how to do that. And one of the things you do is document the heck out of it, don't do anything you can't recover, and do it systematically so you don't miss stuff. So what we did was we took the mowed area and we divided it into 10 foot by 10 foot squares. We made a giant grid out of it. And I mean, this is like archaeology 101. You just survey the surface, you're surveying the ground instead of surveying people. So, at the beginning, each square meaning a 10 foot by 10 foot square, was photographed, and a sketch was done. I'll show you what the survey forms look like. A little sketch was done of what it looked like when you started. So you have a completely mowed flat square. You, me, whoever, gets assigned that square, and you sketch out everything you see on the surface. Okay. Next step, using barbecue skewers. The traditional thing that not traditional, but the more conventional thing that we use for probing when you think there might be a stone down there are barbecue skewers for sure, but they're bamboo. And you try and put a piece of bamboo in that field, give it out. So what we did is, sorry, gotta go one more. You get your 10 foot square, you've done your little pre-drawing, and you probe the soil with your handy dandy barbecue skewer, our stainless steel, and you basically probe the soil every 2 inches. And you record anything you find. You don't dig. You probe the whole darn square, and you mark it as you go. And after that, and you mark it with your invisible fence flags. And so when you're done, you have this field in front of you, and we have heavy vegetation that has to be removed, stumps that have to be removed, all that stuff. But you end up with an image of what you've seen. So one of the things you see are grave depressions. These folks were probably not buried in caskets because, first of all, the holes are not that deep. This is long before vaults and all those sorts of things were added. But more importantly, the soil's not that deep, really. And for caskets, you need milled lumber. You need a skilled cabinet maker. You need a casket maker somewhere. Those folks didn't show up in this area until much, much later. So these are probably folks wrapped in shrouds and then put in the ground, surrounded with rocks, and then back up. And what happens is those graves decompose. What had been a flat piece of ground to start with caves in. And that is a really good indication of, there might be something here. So if you see one of those depressions, you mark that up, you shade that in on your little form. Okay, so this is what those survey forms look like. There's a blank one, really easy. It's just a piece of graph paper, basically. It's 10 by 10, divided up into little 6-inch intervals. And then this is what one looks like from a very busy square. So this one is Hulda Young's square, although she's got neighbors. So that right there was her headstone lying on the ground. This is, just rough sketch, just to give you, the whole point of this was to document every single step of the way, so that if we had to go back later and figure out, what's going on there? these all go together. Turns out you can cut them all up into squares and link them. There was a depression right there next to her. These blobs are rocks that are on the surface. There's another depression right behind her, and there's a rock at the end of it, and there's a rock. And then anything like transcription of what's on the stone, any of that. I mean, this is nice because you got a whole marble stone here. We only had 14 to start with, so this is one of the magic ones. But that's what a filled out one would look like. Okay, so here's our first crew in 2007. This thing over here, this is basically the grid we started with. So it's a 10 by 10 grid of a 100 foot by 100 foot plot. And each of these squares is a square that gets assigned. What do we see in this? Okay, I laid out my grid square to that big field that we mowed. Guess what? The stones are in a nice, neat row, as it turns out, and I'll tell you how we know that, completely diagonal to the axis of what had been mowed. Now, if you go back to historic aerial images, it's very subtle, but you can see that what had happened over time, the oldest one I could find was like 1960s. But what was happening over time, every time it was mowed, whoever was doing it shifted a little bit and kept going, until it was completely at a 45-degree angle to what they ended up mowing. Now, the reason we know that this is the row is it turns out some of these stones, we'll get to what they look like, these stones have really, the marble stones, have very heavy bases that they sit on. The bases don't go anywhere. Maybe the grave subsides and they fall over, but they don't go sideways, and nobody picks them up when they're mowing and moves them around. They stay right where they started out. And so when you find those bases by probing, or they're sitting on the surface or whatever, and you write them, you've discovered that, lo and behold, they're all in nice, neat rows. And guess what? The rocks are too. The headstones that are field stones, they're right in a line with everybody else. This is very rationally laid out. There's a 19th century convention, 18th as well, that's frequently followed, especially in New England, where the rows are laid out north to south, and the east face, okay, here's the compass is here. This is east, right out here. And the way it works is the head of the stone, the headstone, rather, is at the west end of the grave. So when I sit up on Judgment Day, I'm facing the rising sun. Okay, that's a legend kind of thing, but the rows are often laid out north to south. Now, when you get later into the 19th century, you start getting these garden cemeteries, and they're much more botanically arranged and whatever, and you get curvy roads and plots. There are not plots here. There are not, family plots. There are simply grave, 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 grave in a row. And that's a kind of standard family cemetery arrangement. You just start in one spot and you go chronologically. That's what this is. So this is our first crew, and they are in square A1, which is right there, a green one. See that one? That's the square. This is, where you go? Kent Young, right there, that's his square. Kent's no longer with us either. But anyway, they're all standing in the middle of the square. And Kent probed this square. You see there's no flags in it? Because there's nothing there. Poor Kent. He probed the whole thing, and he just works himself to the bone. And couldn't find a thing. And he was, really perplexed by this. And I would go over and help him out. It's like, no, there's really nothing there, Kent. He did it a second time. It was a lot of work. And it's like, Kent, it's okay. You know what that tells us? We're outside the cemetery. A finding of a non-finding is an important finding in research. It tells you that we're in the null set now. You're outside the boundary. Yay. Because look again at these lines. If you rotated the squareness around, you'd see that the stones stop right here, okay? And you can't see it very clearly in this photo. I can see it because I know what it looks like on the ground. But right here, there's a drop-off. If you went down to the cemetery today, because now the grass is sort of shrunken and the ground has sort of laid itself out nicely, and you looked along this line right here, you'd see that the ground sort of drops. It's not dramatic, but it's about 6 inches, and it just kind of curves down. It's because that's the area that was in use, the stuff to the side of it. And so in use, stuff was mowed, stuff was laying, and it built up. The stuff to the side, not so much. So it just happened that over the years with this funky rotation, all of a sudden this bit over here is being mowed now, but it didn't used to be because it wasn't in the cemetery. But anyway, Ken was very disappointed because like, there's a perfectly good marble tombstone right there. And it's like, why not mine? Well, because you're outside the cemetery. Okay, the rows are laid out on a north-south axis, and they're facing east. And the nice thing about this, I remember I said there were headstones and footstones, and that's because they did need to economize. They didn't have infinite space. And so if you had maybe a short one and a long one, you could tuck somebody else into like a half row there if you had another little short person. And that happened. There were plenty of little short persons that had to be buried. And the other nice thing about this crazy cockeyed axis is one of the things that happens when you have an expectation of, oh, okay, my rows are all like this, and there's a blank spot, there's probably somebody there. Well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But your brain wants to fill in the gaps in a nice, neat way because everything was on a diagonal. We just had to probe the soil every 2 inches and find what we find. And you couldn't go by what you thought should be there because it was going to look random. And that actually served our purpose. Okay, so 2007. That's after we started in July with the first snow. That's after one season of prospecting and, as somebody would work on a square, find a stone, get it all laid out and say, okay, here's what it looks like. Now it's time to do something. What they had to do was elevate any stone they found to grade level. So the buildup from all that mowing and leaving things laid ranged from 4 inches on average to, in some places, 36 inches of extra stuff. I'll show you that one. And everything in between. I'd say the average was about 10 to 12 inches. That's a lot of buildup. But, that's what everything was just down there. When we probed with our handy dandy skewers, okay, these are, I believe, 14 inches long. So when we're probing, if we're lucky, we're hitting something about that deep, 8 inches or so. And what we're hitting, I mentioned that the bases of these big marble stones don't travel. The other thing that doesn't travel much are the field stones because they're not heavy. They're not boulders. They're not round, glacial, erratic type things. They tend to have located, and you'll see some of these, slices, either because it was a piece of rock and they split it and made it into a slice, or because that's just the way they found it, wherever it happened to be. I have a whole backyard full of these things. And they sunk them in the ground vertically. So when we're probing the soil, we're hitting the top of the stone. We're not hitting something laying flat, generally. We're just hitting maybe an area that big in square footage, but we had to hit the top. Now, we learned very quickly that if we hit something like that and it kept going, it seemed bigger than a piece of gravel, you come in from the side, and then you could hit the wall. Essentially, you're hitting stone, stone, stone. Ah, that's probably something. And then you put a blue flag on it. So you see all these blue flags down here. This is Forest Tracy again. This is Tracy land. See, everybody else is way up here. And then we got Tracy land. I would call it Tracy land because it's the only named stone down there. Dollars to donuts, it's other Tracys. But we will never know. This is all conjecture in terms of who's where when you're dealing with rocks. Okay, that's 2007. This is 2008. So more stuff coming up. And then 2009, more stuff. Now look at Forest Tracy land. This area, which is all Forest Tracy, we've got forests, and you can see they're all in rows. And you can see these funny little lines. This is one of the few field stones that was actually above surface that you could actually trip over if you were looking around back there. It's about 12 inches taller than that below ground. It's a huge piece of basalt that's split. And the footstone is its twin. And not its twin, it's the piece that was on the other side. There is a definitive row here. We've got this one, this one. There's a foot for this, there's no head. It's been driving me crazy for 12 years. But I know there's somebody there because there was a depression. And that's where the paperwork comes in. If I go back to that square and look at it, I will see. It's been leveled now so that mowing can happen, but I can see in the paperwork there was a depression there. And then you've got this random person over here. Who knows? It's a short grave. It's definitely a grave. That stone, you can tell by the lichens on top, that's what was on the surface on this one. It was about 2 inches above the soil. But when we first started, that's the other thing that happened. When we first started, there was heavy vegetation. Every summer when we mowed it, every time it was mowed, the fewer blackberries, puckerbrush, that sort of thing came back in. It went back to grass. Grass is not a normal thing in Korea. It just isn't. That had been a hay field as well as a potato field. They would probably planted timothy or something in there when they turned it into a cemetery from a potato field, because it would have had furrows and the whole bit. And the ground would shrink. That was the other thing. We'd come back each year and more stones would be like looking at us. They're not like they heaved up with the frost. It's just the ground, by cutting off all the top vegetation, it dried out. And so the ground shrank away a little bit. That's 2009. Okay, so this is that original sketch I did. It's upside down, and I'll show you why in just a second, so that you can see the reference. That's my sketch. That's really what was going on. Okay, that's really where the stones are. So in 2006, when we started, this is colored green because it means we haven't done anything yet. That's just the plot of the 14 marble stones that were found on the surface. Okay, so now we put the grid lines in. That's our work area. And these are the ones, these are the squares that were completed in 2007. This is Forrest Tracy down here in the corner, all by his lonesome, except he's got 4 double chips. Then we get to 2008 and 2009, a little bit more, just keeps creeping. 2010 was a very busy year. We had tons of field stones that were raised that year. Those squares are kind of fun because they go fast. And the ones with the marble stones are tedious because they have lots of moving parts and they're a pain in the neck to raise and all that stuff. But the field stones are, well, we had a big crew in 2010. And 2011, what you're seeing is that more and more of these things are blue. Blue are the field stones. Red are the marble stones. I didn't point this out when it happened, but at this point, we now have 4 new marble stones that were found, completely submerged. Those are the treasures. And they were found a number of different ways, but we'll get there. That's 2012, so there's more activity going every year. Every year that we make progress. 2013. So, and 2014, which was the last year of excavations. It was pretty much wrapped up at that point. So, notice this corridor right here is all green. It's ledge. We got to this rock right here, and it's a tiny grave, and it barely has a footstone, which is no, the footstones are not on here because it just gets too cluttered. This is showing you only the headstones. All of the fieldstone headstones have footstones that go with them, but this one is a tiny short grave, obviously a child, and right there the ledge humps up, and it sort of curves around like this, and we knew perfectly well we were outside the pale. And these things, these round circles, when we first started finding these are big boulders. They are big, round glacial erratics. And we thought, these don't look at all like the other fieldstone headstones. They're not set, they're just big round boulders. And then it turned out they were all in a line. It's like, can only be so dense in this thing. And what they are is they're the edge. On that side of the cemetery, the edge is marked with these big boulders, and they keep on going. I mean, they could have been moved by oxen, but they were probably dragged off to the side, and they left big voids, so that was good, because now you have a soil pocket where you didn't before. But the entire northern edge of the cemetery is marked with these big boulders. Now, these were so big, and they were covered over with a lot of dirt, that we were not about to raise them. Yes, technically you could do that, but why? So what we did was we asked people who were dividing their daylilies and such to donate daylilies. And that whole row now is planted with daylilies. So there's a visible marker on top so we know what's down there, and we've obviously got paperwork to prove it, and photographs and the whole bit, but we decided to mark it on the surface instead of trying to deal with those giant boulders. Okay, so I want to tell a couple of quick stories about what we did find, so you can know a little bit more about the who, and it also explains how this all works. So this is Louis Stewart, and Louis was a little person. He was aged 5 months and 4 days. AE is an abbreviation and essentially means the age they were when they died. Okay, so AE with a little ligature, which is what happens when you stick 2 letters together in typesetting, is that abbreviation in Latin. That's what that means. And you'll see it a lot on old gravestones. Okay, so this is Louis' headstone. This is what it looked like when we were tromping around initially, found it. That's a December 2006 photo. That headstone right there is right there on the ground. That's where we found it. That is the base. And that's what I mean by bases don't move. It was down about 12 inches underground, squashed, and you can see it's tipped over. And there was actually a bit of a depression there. This is not exactly the first photograph, but I needed to be able to see all the stuff going on in here. But that's the base for his stone. So look, that is 8 feet from there to there. So that's what happens. These things fall over. They're lying on the ground. Some well-meaning person comes along and mows and goes, oh, there's a gravestone. I'll drag it out of here and get out of the way. And I'll mow some more. And then it's migrated. And it eventually migrated 8 feet. So then you have this, which is a different style stone. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's Noah and Abigail Young. It's a twin stone, husband and wife. This is Noah's potato field, and that's his tombstone. Okay, so here's a quickie of how these things are constructed. There's 2 different forms in this particular cemetery. Louis is this kind. It's a tablet, and it lives in a slotted base. The base is granite, and it has a 2-inch channel cut out of it. And that marble just sits down in there, and originally would have had a soft mortar in it, which with freezing and thawing, it lets go, and it falls down. No big deal. Nobody gets hurt. We just put it back. That's really easy, and that's what we ended up doing. This is a more modern construction that came in the later 19th century. These are 3-part stones, often called die stones. It has a big honker base at the bottom, which can be granite, can be marble, any number of things, can be totally junk. And then this is the part that shows, mostly, usually marble, sometimes granite, then this is the marble version. Here's the kicker. The clever guys who figured out they could do this in the later 19th century thought, ooh, iron pins, that'll make it all stick together, way better. Yeah, until the iron rusts and corrodes, and marble's porous. All stone's porous. Marble's really porous. And the water goes in, and it expands and contracts, and it's set in sulfur often, and that makes it worse. Anyway, what happens is these iron pins rust, they oxidize, and they get fatter. They look like this horrible thing up here, which you can come look at later. That's a piece of oxidized iron that had been set in sulfur. And they blow the stone apart, is what happens. That's what happened too. Okay, so that's Louis. There's his slotted base. There's a slot, nice and empty. Isn't it great? There's his footstone. It's stuck down in the ground. And John's sitting up at grade level, more or less. And then this is about the top of his footstone is at 8 inches below the surface. So that's how much buildup is out there in Louis land. This is what marble pins do. Iron pins do. This is Noah's and Abigail's stone. It has a marble base, a marble mid-base. You can see the cruddy stuff in there. And then these pins have just completely rusted off and rotted and fallen, it's dead, and it fell over. Big, fat, 4-inch thick hunk of marble on top. It actually has a very elaborate double epitaph on the back. It's quite a lovely stone. But but you can see why, you can't see how that big, that's about 8 inches deep. So that base isn't going to go anywhere. So when we find the base, we realize, oh, here we are, here's the rope. And look, there's somebody else right next to them. Okay, so here's all the stuff happening in this square. So this is all in one square. Remember, it's diagonal to everything in the world. So these strings, those are the lines of the square. So we got Noah and Abigail up here, We got Louis' headstone, Louis' base, and Louis' footstone. And that's all in John Square. He's got to deal with that. And this right here is what happens when people love cemeteries to death. This is a stone that is the same construction as Louis. It's a tablet and a granite base. But somebody came along in the 20th century, and when the original mortar bond let go and it fell over, they came and fixed it. And what they fixed it with was Portland cement. Well, Portland cement doesn't let go like the soft mortar does. It has up and down. Now the poor stone has cement shoes. So when the stone tries to move with the frost and all that, it can't budge. So it's not going to just fall over, it's going to snap right at the frost line. And we spend the other half of the time dealing with that. So, okay, so that's more or less put back in place. Louis' stone is reset with soft mortar, and his footstone's been raised up. This is actually waiting for the repair guy to come. It's not done, it's simply sitting there with the base leveled. Okay, forest. Remember we talked about forest, way down in his corner. So, that's what it looked like in 2006 after the magic mowing people came. And he's another small child, he's 10 months, and this is his square. Well, not his square, but it's the square that he's in, let's put it that way. See the blue flag there? That's that big field stone that I showed you the picture of earlier. It was one of the few that we could see on the surface when we started. And there it is. Now that's it raised up. That's the soil line, the original soil line is right there. So it came up about 8 to 10 inches. And like I said, there's another foot below there. It's a monstrous stone, really, really pretty. So right next to that, this is what it looked like when little bit of shadow line, you can see, that's a depression right there. And this was right at the top. There's lichens growing on the top, which means it was on surface. You could see it right where that orange barbecue skewer is. That's a rock that somebody discovered. And sure enough, that's what it was. That's another foot, that's a footstone that goes with the headstone. This is a piece of pink granite. And that was the other thing that's really interesting. They tried to match the head and the foot. Not identically, but, they wouldn't have stuck a piece of basalt down there. They had a piece of pink granite for a head, so they found another piece of pink granite for the foot. And turns out Forrest has company. See the blue flags? They're all in a row. Those are all stones. They actually haven't been raised up yet. But those are all things that were found by probing in those squares back there. So that's what it looked like to start with. Oops. And Louis got neighbors. I keep calling Louis. Forrest has neighbors. So that's probably all various relatives of him. We'll never know. There are in the town records, we can tell who died, which years, if we're lucky. Not always children, but still. But it doesn't say where they're buried. So the way this thing is laid out, like I said, there aren't plots per se, but it is roughly in family groups. And then within a family group, by the patriarch of the family, then they'll be chronological. Okay, this is Rebecca Young's stone. Rebecca Young was the daughter of Roland and Sophronia Young. She died in 1869. This is the oldest inscribed stone in the cemetery. You can see it's in kind of rough shape. So this photo was that 2006 when we first started prospecting around. That's all you could see of Rebecca. She was way down in the weeds. This was maybe a year or so later. You could see the fragments of Rebecca. That's the bottom of her stone. There's a whole bunch of marble crumbles in there. Marble, when it deteriorates in weather, when it breaks, usually, somewhere in there you've got acid rain, all kinds of stuff. And I've got a couple bags up here, what's called sugared marble. It's basically the calcium carbonate that's holding the quartzite crystals together dissolves. And you just end up with a bunch of quartzite sand. And that's what was going on with Rebecca. Her stone was dissolving. And so here's the vital statistics on her. She died when she was 16 years, 5 months. I looked her up in the death book and the town records, and she died of typhus. Now, There's a whole lot of other stuff. There's a lot more information on her stone. And it turns out there's kind of an interesting story going on here. So the very beginning up there is just Rebecca's vital statistics, right there. She died, okay? Then, keep on reading. Now, this is a transcription of what's on the stone because it's kind of hard to read on the marble. And it's, it says she died, and 16 years, 5 months. Also named on her stone are her father, Captain R.B. Young, 45 years, 6 months. Horatio A., his son, would be her brother, 21 years. Both lost at sea from SCHR period Rio. SCHR period is the abbreviation for schooner. Okay, that becomes important. And then this after fact in the bigger font on the bottom, Thompson Young, lost from the same vessel, October 4th, 1869, age 30 years. What the heck happened on October 4th, 1869? Is what I said. Okay, up here I've got lost at sea from Sahir, Rio. That's not a typo. That is what became an apocryphal tale that got played forward for many, 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 many years. And this is what happens with public records and transcriptions that are in error, and then they get promulgated forward into other documents. And from about 1965 on, everybody's looking from Sahir Rio. Sahir Rio isn't a thing. Schooner Rio is. It was Captain Young's boat. Okay? So, I'm looking at the tombstone, and I can see that it says SCHR, Schooner Rio. So I look up Schooner Rio. And October 4th, 1869. What happened then was Saxby's Gale. Saxby's Gale was, you've heard of the perfect storm? Saxby's Gale was the perfect storm in the 19th century. It was a humongous superstorm. Basically, big storm coming across the land and a hurricane coming up the coast, and they hit each other and blew up. And they just kept getting worse and worse and worse as it went up the eastern seaboard, and eventually sucked a 30-foot tidal wave up into the Bay of Fundy and flooded everything in its path and wiped out endless numbers of vessels, and not a lot of loss of life, incidentally. But unfortunately for Captain Young and the other 4 men on his ship, they were all lost at sea. So this made the New York Times. These are all from the Ellsworth American. It was in the New York Times. It was in the Bangor Daily News. I mean, you look for Schooner Rio, you can actually find it. And so I'll read the text. It's kind of fuzzy up here. I'll read the text that's important. It says, it is reported that the schooner Rio of Machias was lost near Eastport with all her crew consisting of Captain Roland B. Young and 4 other men, all belonging in one school district in Gouldsboro. 3 of them leave families. Okay, so we've got a total of 5 adult males in a town, Indian Harbor, which had only 29 adult males at the time. That is a huge hit in a village the size of Indian Harbor. In the town the size of Gouldsboro, it was a huge hit. As far as I can tell, I haven't learned of anybody who knows of a worse maritime disaster for the town of Gouldsboro, then or since. And nobody knew about it. Because the only tie back to it was this mostly destroyed tombstone. The problem is, this story is pretty much accounted for on this tombstone, and it's the oldest one in the cemetery, but it's also in the worst condition. So I love this photo. It's sort of like one of those crime scene things with the tape. You've got this, like, what happened here thing. So her tombstone, you can see this little tiny boulder up here. That's what took out the top corner of that headstone. It fell at some point, and what it fell on was that rock right there that's below the surface, and it just smacked it. But the bigger problem is it's rotting, essentially. The stone is sugaring all through here, and that inscription that talks about all these other people is right here. And there are horizontal cracks all through this stone, right through here. Yes, technically, you can actually put it back together and stick it back into the cemetery. You can put consolidants into it and all kinds of magic. However, it's going to fail. And where it's going to fail next time is right through that inscription. And that's the most important part. So the decision was made, the more prudent way to go was to do a replica of the stone, which was going to cost us a lot of money because there's over 200 characters on this stone. So, interim solution was it became our poster child for why one takes care of old cemeteries. And it's in a display now at the Historical Society Museum. And in the meantime, a local sign maker made us a temporary replica that sat in the place of the original. And we basically restored her site. The base is still there, right there. Got a nice trough in it. It's all ready to go. Base is still there. That's her footstone. On the back was a commercial to see the original of the stone and to donate toward its permanent replacement. Go to the Historical Society Museum. It took us 4 years, but we raised the money that it would take to do the replica. And at the front of it, we chose purple slate for it. And the reason for that was we did not want to try to pretend like it was the original. We didn't want to, we don't want to use marble. Marble doesn't hold up. We could have used toned granite, which kind of imitates the look of marble, but we didn't want it mistaken for a pretend version of the original. Purple slate is what those oldest stones are that are about the same age as this. Purple slate's what's over on Crowley Island in the original, her great-grandparents' stones. And so we chose purple slate. It holds up really, really well. And the front of the stone is a replica of, it's a replica of the text that's on the original. And then on the back, we added, because as it said, there were 5 men lost. Well, there's only 3 accounted for in Rebecca, on Rebecca's stone. Her father, her brother, and her uncle. Turns out Thompson Young is her mother's brother. 2 other men who were cousins of the captain were also lost. Abijah and Alexander Young were also lost, and their names are written on the back. And it also says this stone erected 2016, which is when this happens. So this stone was carved up in Monson, Maine at Sheldon Slate. This is Bob Travers and Barry Canner helping John move Rebecca's crate to the hole where she was going to go, and then it's being installed. And that's what it looks like right now. And at the same time, that was 2016, and so then we had a party and rededicated the cemetery, and it has its own boulder now that has the name of the cemetery on it. So Rebecca's right out there. Turns out she's right in the middle of the cemetery. I have a feeling it's one of the oldest parts of the cemetery. Okay, here's the fun story. I remember I told you there was a 36-inch buildup in one place. It's right there. This big hump. This is James Young. James is sitting over here. This is how he was found. This is his square. And that looks very weird because it's all curvy. It's because of this darn hump that's in the middle of it. We had to work on James Square in a hurry the year we're going to have all the repairs done. So we had to find his base because we knew when you picked him up, there's nothing under him. So his base must be somewhere nearby. Got to be in here someplace. So start the excavation. And start, the survey and probe the soil. Okay, so John's probing the soil, looking for his base. And he'd start digging into what we thought was a rock pile. Well, there were clay rocks on top, but it turns out there weren't any rocks underneath. It looked soft and crumbly and soil and peat. Like, uh-oh. He goes down. He's just working his way down, and lo and behold, he finds this interesting-looking thing, which is quite clearly laying flat on its back, a base, mid-base, top stone. Those 3-part stones with the iron pins I told you about, that's what that is. If you look at it sideways, it's pitched over, it's under that pile of dirt. There he goes. So he's got this at the edges marked with a skewer so he knows where he's got his plastic trowel out, because I told him, no more metal stubbles. He starts uncovering. There's a lot of dirt on top of this thing. And he keeps going, and now you can see I'm actually standing on top of that bump. This isn't sideways. I'm just looking down on it. There's the base, there's the mid-base, and this is the top of the stone. He's slowly uncovering it. And there is the whole top surface of it. It's way far out. It's nowhere near out yet. Here's James's base, right there. You can see it, too, is pitched over. Somehow, the top of James's stone apparently didn't get buried because it's been traveling around. It's Dorcas. Dorcas is James's mother. She's right next to him. She turns out she died a couple of years before him. So that's the chronological row thing. Okay, so we keep going. All right, we've got this dirt pile, which is clearly not a stone pile. It's not the edge of the cemetery, so keep going. Uh-oh, there's more. That's that corner. And there for scale, you can see there's a plastic shovel, and the skewer is marking the corner. So now we're looking at not one of those big fat things that's going to have pins in it. That's a 2-inch thick tablet coming. So probably an older stone. And there's just cutting into the hill. It's just gobs and gobs of dirt. At that point, we had a yard sale, literally selling dirt. Now, that's the top of a tablet, but it's broken off. It's Joel. Joel is James's older brother, also Dorcas's son, but just half of Joel. And at that point, we panicked because we thought, oh, there are all these stories about stones being stolen and going up. Well, the bottom half of the stone is where the epitaph is, and it's sometimes like the collectible part. You do that sort of thing. So we put a sign up at the post office. Have you seen the bottom of this stone? Because you can only dig this amount of dirt away so fast, you know. But John kept digging, and oh, well, there's the bottom. It was underneath. It was there all along. We just hadn't dug far enough. So it's right there. This is looking the other way. This is Joel's stone right here. This is Dorcas. And right there is the base for Joel's stone, the top that had gotten knocked over. You can see something big went by and knocked all these guys down. Okay, that's the 2 pieces of Joel's stone. There's the inscription. Put water on it. It's already got mud on it, so you put water on it, it makes the letters pop right out. You can read it quite readily. Okay, so we went back to public records and tried to piece together what's going on because we have census data and we were able to figure out who Joel was and who James was and Dorcas and their family relationships just using census and other town records would fill in all those gaps. We still didn't know how old James was because his was one of those stones where the pins blew out the back and you couldn't read it. It was completely obliterated at the time. Okay, that's Dorcas. This is to show you where her footstone is. See that over there? That's her footstone. It's still under this big hunk of dirt. So this dirt pile just took over the whole family. Okay. Now, Dorcas is back upright. She's ready to be repaired. Her base is leveled and her sight's ready. Joel's not ready yet. That is his footstone, right out there. See the blue flag? It's like, okay, there it is. The other one is this. That is the top of a field stone. This is all one family. James, Dorcas, Joel, and right over here is who I call Old Joel, Dorcas's father. Right here is a fieldstone. Headstone. Pretty good chance that is old Joel's wife, Sarah, because Sarah died after old Joel. There wouldn't have been anybody to purchase a headstone for her, so she got a rock. It makes sense just because, you know, we'll never know, but it makes sense because these are chronological. Here's our best guess of what happened with this family. The stones are all placed in a row, all nice and neat. Tree grows. These happen. This is why you don't want trees in cemeteries and you can possibly avoid it. At some point, the tree falls over. Boom. Knocks everybody down. They're all in the same direction, laying that way. And then the bole of the tree and the roots and all that stuff go with it, but they're all piled up on top. And that rots over time. And James is kind of stuck off on one corner here. This is John's artistic rendition of this thing, but it makes the best story we've got. So James is off in the corner, and at some point, somebody just picks him up, not the whole stone, just the top of it, and sets it aside. So he's never covered by that hill, but he's out there all by himself. And so when we're looking for James's face, we find the whole tribe. Okay, so there they are, more or less repaired. And their footstones are all up, and they're all back together. So, the last of the bunch. This is kind of my favorite story because it's a real cautionary tale. This is a square right here that we had just finished the mowing for the end of the season. We were raking it all up, which was hot and dry and a lot of work. And I had a pitchfork in my hand. It's the kind that's really a pitchfork. It's not a digging fork. It's got the 4 pointy tines. Goes through this stuff really well. And I was tired and I jammed it and I was out beyond any stuff, nowhere near anybody. And I was out in what we thought was the pathway through the cemetery. And I jammed the pitchfork into the ground and it went clunk. And all 4 times just lined up perfectly. And after you do this for a while, you can tell the difference between hitting a rock or a piece of gravel or a pebble and a large flat piece of stuff that goes clunk and has this really nice acoustic sound to it. Well, that's what happened in my pitchfork. Now, I'm the one who says, no metal tools. Yeah, and I just jabbed a pitchfork into something that felt a whole lot like a tombstone. And it was. So, yeah, these, you can see the skewers. They're marking the outer perimeter of what's under there. And right here, we're at the base of the stone. That's literally the base, and that's the marble tablet. It's liberated itself. The grave is sunken. There was no depression there when I came by. The grave had sunk, and the tablet itself had liberated, just fallen over. It wasn't broken, not in the least. And we just kept going, and it just kept getting deeper and deeper. The head of it fell, like it's diagonal, not diagonal, downward into the subsided grave. The top of this stone is like 15 inches below the surface. But the top end, where I hit it, was probably, 6 or 8. What I actually hit, turns out, wasn't the marble, I hit the base. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Anyway, there's the tombstone, right there, lurking in the middle of nowhere. Martin Christensen, age 34 years. It's a very simple stone, but it has a quite spiffy epitaph right here. We'll see it better later. Which starts with, gone before us, O our brother, to the spirit land. Okay. Now, you cannot take epitaphs literally, but maybe there's a clue in that. What this says is Martin Christensen, age 34 years, October, I think it says 17th, 1894. Doesn't say father of, doesn't say son of, doesn't say husband of. He's just Martin Christensen, all by his lonesome. So I went to the Grange that week and I said, okay, who's here heard of Martin Christensen? And we get about as many blank stares as I'm getting right now. I mean, who's heard of anybody named Christensen around here, right? It's not Tracy, it's not Stewart, it's not Decker, it's not any of those names. But, we had nothing to go on. And I looked at the census, that's my go-to place. He died in 1894. So he wasn't here in 1880. Anybody who does any kind of genealogical work knows that in 1890, there is no census. It burned up in the Library of Congress. By 1900, he's gone. So he's in the cracks. He doesn't get covered. So I have a friend who, I did find him, however. I found his death record in the town death book. He died of phthisis, which is consumption. But most importantly, it gave me the name of his father and his mother, and he's from Norway. Well, duh, his name is Christensen. No big surprise. Okay, so what happens is I told a friend of mine about this drama that was going on. She said, oh, I got a friend who does Scandinavian genealogy. In 3, I'll give you the particulars, I'll find out. 3 days took her. And she came back with like a 5-page report on Martin. It was great. It was like instant stuff. Martin was a younger son from a farming family from the coast of Norway. And it was actually a small fishing village, very much like Indian Harbor. He and his brother Carl emigrated to this area. And after the 1880 census, but by 1894 he was dead, so somewhere in there. And they set up, they were younger sons, so they stood nothing to gain from inheritance. So they sought their fortune here in the New World. Carl survived. Carl stuck around. Carl was a boarder right down the street from my house, turns out. That epitaph Gone before us, oh thou brother, that was the little teeny hint that maybe there'd be somebody else named Christensen. And there was, Carl, the brother. So we cleaned up Martin's stone, we reset it. It wasn't broken, it was a super easy thing to do. There we are resetting it. And there he is. This is my excuse, okay? This is where the cemetery stuff really ends. They stuck Martin right here on the edge. He was in the road. So, you know, I was perfectly legit sticking that pitchfork on his head. But anyway, that's where Martin is. And that's what his stone looks like. It's a lovely piece of white marble that his brother bought for him. His brother was a fisherman who worked for other people. He was paid, so he had money to buy a tombstone. And that's what Martin looks like now. Now there's a little side thing here. We're worried about vandalism. Within 2 weeks of Martin's stone, and one of the things is when stones are buried under the ground like that, and they get no sunlight, and they're just in sand, they come out, they're brilliant white. I mean, once the mud washes off them, they're brilliant white because the lichens aren't going to grow in the dark. So we put it up there, and in 2 weeks, some raccoon came around in the night and went on the back of the stone. That's the beginning of biofilm, which has turned into footprint lichens. I love it. But anyway, when I was telling people about this, I went back and reported all this stuff in the Grange. It's like, well, that's who Martin is. Like, that's why we do this. This is the only record that Martin was ever here. He's not in any public records, except his death record is there. But good luck finding that. But that tombstone is the only evidence he ever lived here. And that's why we do it. Why it's worth all the trouble. Even though I did stab him with a pitchfork. So, that's where we started. That's the 2006 picture. There's some pictures of sort of, and then what happened. So, as we go from 2000, now we're jumping ahead to the ones you haven't seen, 2010. It just keeps growing. 11. Now it's starting to look like a real cemetery, and this is when the grass is coming in. And it turns out, okay, there's Martin, but that really is the path. That's where, this is the original entrance over here. When we first started, we were coming in there and looking at the backs of everybody. We've since moved it. The path is now the original, on the track pretty much of the original path. And it would have come in here and gone across there. One of the things with cemeteries, particularly old cemeteries, if they had the room, you'd have an entry and an exit, because things were being brought down there by ox cart, and ox do not like to back up. So you have an in and an out, and then you can circle around, and that path is there. There's 12. Now it's really looking official. It's basically just clean up at this point. 14 was the last year of excavations, and now it's down to just, it looks like lawn. That's an aerial photo that was done in 2018, so you can kind of see the perspective of the whole thing. We started out with, I always check my numbers here, 14 marble stones on the surface, plus one rock. And some of those 14 stones had multiple names, like Rebecca's. Rebecca's has 4 names on it. So the 14 stones accounted for 24 souls, so people buried. Rebecca's stone is kind of weird because 3 of those people aren't buried here, but they are commemorated. When we ended up in 14, we had 18 marble stones and 36, I think it's 36 plus or minus fieldstone marked graves, which brings us up to, depending on how you count these things, somewhere between 60 and 65 souls. So a field that size, if you look at it, that pathway is about 30 feet wide, and it arcs through here. It comes out and goes into the woods again back there. So that takes up a lot of the space. But 60 or so people is probably about right. You could put more in there, but I think there are places where the ledge humps up that we didn't hit because we weren't hitting anything near the surface. But this area back up in here, that soil is very, very thin, and it would be pretty hard to put people in there. So we think we've gotten most of it. You never know. So back to that favorite picture. So I just pull that out every now and then as an inspiration. That's what it looks like now. We mow it. The goal is not to make it forest lawn. The goal is to keep the stuff from growing back and losing it. So we mow it twice a year at the beginning of, well, sort of early summer, end of June, something like that, because that's when all the grass comes up, goes to seed, and we let it self-sow, and then we mow it. And then we mow it at the end of the season in October sometime, and that keeps the heavy stuff from growing. But it's a 19th century cemetery. It was never meant to be mowed flat like a modern cemetery. Probably would have been cut with the scythe originally. That's what it looks like now too. And we have a lot of people to thank. So we got Seaside Grange, the Historical Society, Scuda Community Fund, Maine Old Cemetery, and the Association for Gravestone Studies, which is an international organization. The Rebecca Fund donors, people came out of the woodwork to give us money for Rebecca, and all of our volunteers, and especially John. John has spent, I don't know how many, hundreds, thousands, whatever hours and muscle tissue on this project over time. Joe DePasquale and our extra helpers who are no longer with us, Maura Briggs, Bob Mady, and Edith Woodard, Joe, who I mentioned, and Howard Roman, who's another conservator. Without their help, this would not have happened. So, this is actually a little video that was taken a few years ago, and I'm just going to let it play. If anybody has any questions, it's, you just like take a tour while you're watching what's in the background there. Anybody has any questions, I am more than happy to ask them. I know it's getting late. If you haven't signed the petition, I don't think we're allowed to send in multiple signatures to the same people, right? But if you haven't signed it, please do. It's up here on this front table. Okay? Thank you so much for coming. And go visit Mill Pond Center. Oh, I'm sorry, Ginny.
Oh, that's okay. No, have you guys ever thought about doing ground penetrating radar?
Yes, that was addressed. Actually, it was your father who brought that up. No surprise. About 2009, something like that. We basically talked to the folks who were at the University of Maine, Orono Geology Department. They had a GPR sled. The question, if you didn't hear it, was about ground penetrating radar, which is like radar. Well, it's just what it says. It's radar that goes down. And it will give you a cross-section of what's underground. And it's used a lot of times to find cemeteries that are lost. You hear a lot about it these days in the news. However, the problem with GPR is that it requires, first of all, it requires a relatively uninterrupted surface. And at the time, we had lots of rocks and stuff on the top. But more importantly, we had lots of rocks down below that were non-substantive rocks. And it was going to cost a lot of money, but the bigger problem was we didn't have a really good site for it. And there were a lot of obstacles, so they couldn't get a good pass back and forth either. So I've watched a lot of GPR surveys since then, and it works great when you have these big grassy fields where somebody says, oh, that's a slave cemetery there. It's, it's a big grassy field now, but that's where it's perfect, when you have dirt, on a former cemetery.
They do have drone-based GPRs now.
Oh, that's LiDAR, right?
No, they have drone. I'll come talk to you.
Okay, fine. Anyway, yeah.
Jennifer, did you come across any artifacts or skeletal remains during this process?
Simple answer is no. We didn't excavate down the remains. We were looking for rocks. We did find a dog collar and a shotgun shell. Now, there's a story behind that, but I'm not going to go into it. It's a little grim. You can do the math yourselves. Anyway, yes. Yes. Carol, wherever you are.
What was the oldest person whose grave you found?
You mean the oldest grave or the oldest in age?
Oldest in age.
Age. I think it's Noah Young, or it might be Samuel. They were in their high 80s. I don't think there was anybody in their 90s. I think Samuel Young, who was Noah's brother, is the oldest. I think he was like 92, maybe, something like that. It's actually a notable thing. I've got the spreadsheet up there on the table. You just run down and see what the age is. But there are plenty of people that live to be 80s and 90s. I mean, this whole thing about people died young, yeah, yes and no. That's on average. There are plenty of people who live to be in their 70s and 80s and 90s in that time period. And they had rough lives, you know. So,
I had a moralistic aunt who stumbled around in this, she lived down the end of Mill Pond
Yep.
Road and stumbled on this sometime in the late 60s and 70s, raised a moralistic question that still bothers me. Why did they abandon this? Are there any theories about why they abandoned this cemetery, gave up their heritage, so to speak?
yeah, no, that's a great question, and I should have mentioned that up front. It doesn't even need to be a theory. It's a very well-known fact what happened. Okay, so we saw the perimeter, we saw how filled it is. By 1895, they'd used up all the space. It was full. So they stopped using it in 1895. The new Corea Cemetery, which is up on the town road going into the village, is from roughly 1895, and it mostly was started by the Crowleys, which were a huge tribe. There was no way they were going to squeeze them in there. And they all lived to be in their 80s and 90s, so that took them forever to die off. But it filled up around 1895. They stopped using it, and you can almost set your watch by this. A generation, 2 generations tops, after the last person is buried there, cemeteries tend to get abandoned because they forget, people forget, particularly when it's down in the weeds. I mean, the one on Crowley Island is sitting out there in the middle of Bruce and Cindy Crowley's side yard, and nobody's going to forget that one. It's just right there.